Welcome to CapitolView, the weekly program where we talk about state politics and government and how it might just affect you. Joining us this week on CapitolView is Dave Dahl, longtime State House reporter for WTAX Radio. Welcome, Dave.
Bruce, thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks for coming. And also Raymon Troncoso from Capital News, Illinois. Welcome, Raymond.
Thanks for having me, Bruce.
We are taping now as the legislative session is drawing to a close. They have 5 days and counting, and a lot of stuff needs to get done. A lot of stuff has been done. And a big bombshell dropped yesterday with the indictment of Tim Mapes, former chief of staff to former House Speaker Michael Madigan. The issue, according to the feds, is that he was given immunity to testify before a grand jury and went to the grand jury and said he knew nothing, essentially. And the feds presumably had emails and stuff showing that that probably wasn't the case. And so he's now been charged with perjury. And this is linked to an ongoing scandal involving former Speaker Michael Madigan and Exelon, in which a number of other folks have been indicted. It seems clear that the feds are trying to get to Michael Madigan, and one of his closest people has said, no, I'm not going to testify. To what I know, that's what the charge is. I'll throw it out there, Dave. How shocking is this, and what effect might it have on any pending legislation?
Well, I think if you're following the drip, 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 it's not shocking, but it is significant. And if you were to go, out to the old state capitol plaza like the local TV stations do here and, explain the story to the man on the street and record their reaction, 10 out of 10 wouldn't be able to tell you who the heck Tim Mapes is. 100 out of 100 wouldn't. But he's the right-hand man, chief of staff, man who makes things happen, the man who holds the figurative giant key ring full of keys for Madigan. You've got to go through Mapes. He's a gatekeeper. When Madigan was speaker, Mapes was the gatekeeper. And so presumably he would know everything there is to know about then Speaker Madigan. As you said, the allegation is that even though they granted him immunity, he lied anyway, which shows allegedly what lengths people would go to presumably protect someone, presumably the speaker. You've got to think that they're still going at Madigan. I'm not sure how much help Mapes has been to them, but I think, when you look at, this is the innermost of inner circles in terms of the importance Tim Mapes has to the operation. Will it really lead to an indictment of Madigan? I don't know. They haven't pinned anything illegal on him yet, allegedly. Will it affect any pending litigation? I think already the energy bills here, which someone would call a bailout, but they, would appear to be favorable to big energy. Those are taking on water. And I don't think they've got a great deal of support here. This doesn't help.
Let's be clear here. He is risking prison, and others around him have as well. Mike McLean being one of the chief folks, former legislator, lobbyist, who has indicated to WBEZ radio in Chicago that he's not going to flip. He's not going to cooperate. And so there seems to be, at this point in time, if there's anything that is discernible from what happened yesterday, it seems to me, perhaps, just how tight a wall Michael Madigan has built around him, had built around him.
You want to ask these guys, would you flip on your own mother? They might. They won't flip on Madigan, though.
And what do they call it? Flipper, faster than lightning? I'm dating myself. The
Exelon bar, too.
I was like, it was the dolphin thing. The Exelon bill, because this does connect with Exelon. Exelon is seeking, you can call it a subsidy, a bailout, or a rescue of the environment from global warming because they say they need a bunch of money to keep their nuclear reactors running in Illinois, and without it, they'd shut them down. And we would then have to rely on carbon spewing coal plants, carbon spewing natural gas plants, energy plants. Folks who work at these nuclear plants would lose their jobs. It would be bad. I mean, they seem to have a decent hand here. The governor has said in his initial rollout, $70 million a year for 5 years for a total subsidy of 355 or thereabouts.
Which is more than ComEd paid in the deferred prosecution agreement.
Yep.
We have to understand that the line going through this whole thing, this investigation, the grand jury matter, which we just mentioned, has now resulted in the indictment of Tim Mapes, Chief of Staff to Mike Madigan, is that ComEd wanted to grease some legislation its way. And this would be an example. The bills that we're talking about this year in the General Assembly are bills that could be seen as being favorable to ComEd and its parent company, Exelon. So what's changed there? Other than the fact that ComEd is $200 million poorer to escape prosecution, yet another energy bill that is going to be good for the energy companies.
Yeah, fair enough. Will it actually happen? Again, we got 5 days left. This is one of the major things that's left on the table. We have Exelon. We have the budget. We have budget. Hold on, stop. Let's talk about the budget for a second. Has anybody been talking about the budget? I haven't heard much. What do you think, Raymond? What are you hearing about the budget?
All we know about the budget right now is that the shell bills that will eventually become the budget have passed in both chambers, and that kind of gives leeway to the General Assembly to basically pass them in a single day without much input or public inquiry about what actually goes into the budget. All we had were the proposals from Pritzker a few months ago about the tax changes that are going to presumably be in the budget, but really nobody knows what the meat and potatoes of this is actually going to look like, or even has proposed suggestions of what it's going to look like. It's going to be a surprise to the public when we finally get to see it.
Yeah, we might not see it until the very final day. Legislators may not see it until the very final day. Is this any way to try to figure out how to spend how many $1 billion it is? It's in the $40 billion range, I think. How rational is this that we do our budget process this is not unique. We budgets wait until the last second and stuff. And that's true. But to this degree, for going on this long, is this a rational way for folks for the lawmakers to pass a budget and for people to understand what's really contained in it?
It doesn't.
It's an annual thing.
Yeah,
they don't say it's a rational thing, but it is an annual thing.
Did you say rational or irrational? I'm sorry.
I said they don't say whether it's rational. They don't say it's rational, but it is annual.
It is annual. Fair enough. And I'm sorry if that's a loaded question. Perhaps it was. I'm maybe it's just me, but I'd like to see a little more transparency when it comes to legislative processes, but that doesn't always happen in Illinois, as we all know. Speaking of transparency, let's talk about legislative redistricting maps. They have been released here in the last week, and everybody's happy, aren't they?
Sure.
Okay, where are the rubs, Raymond? What are the issues here?
Well, the issues is that, the maps that we've seen so far, even the Democrats are saying that, these aren't the real maps. These are what they're calling draft maps that they're getting public input on. And so far, the public input has pretty much been anything but positive. Really, what the draft maps are based on is 5 years of aggregate data from the American Community Survey. And what that is, data from the Census Bureau, it is considered to be accurate to a point. It lets you get to the general approximation of how many people you have. But when you get to what we call block level data, the demographics of a district, how many actual people live there, it gets more and more inaccurate as you drill down in specificity. And for a lot of communities, especially the Black community, the Latino community, the Asian American community in Chinatown and Chicago has expressed a lot of concerns about this. It's very inaccurate, and it can lead to a lot of people losing the influence they currently have in the General Assembly.
I mean, speaking of accuracy, it wasn't that long ago where the new census numbers came out, and there had been projections from the Census Bureau that Illinois was in a ton more trouble than it turned out that we actually were in terms of population loss. There had been a lot of doom and gloom that had been based in part largely on projections, because it goes every 10 years. And so 5 years out, 7 years out, where do we think we are? And it turns out the numbers were wrong. And so we don't have a complete census because of the pandemic. It's an absolutely unusual year. And so what's going on here, of course, is that if they don't pass a map, there's a deadline of June. What is it to do it before it gets punted to a bipartisan commission?
Yeah, that's the June 30th deadline.
Right.
The Democrats who are running the map-making process like to tell you that June 30th is the deadline. It's only the deadline for, the only thing that turns into a pumpkin on June 30th is the Democrats' grip on the power here. So it's in their interest to get it done. They don't want to wait for the census because it doesn't come by the June 30th deadline. That's all.
Right. And so if that doesn't happen, if they don't get it done by June 30th, and I would wager that it probably will because the Democrats have the power, then it does get to this bipartisan commission, and they get to make the call. Meanwhile, we have a lot of progressive groups. I think there were about 20 that signed a letter saying that, along with lines of Raymond was saying, that this is undercounting folks. There's communities of color that are being left out. This is not a good thing. Would they prefer these progressive groups that sign a letter prefer a bipartisan process? Do they? It sounds to me like they may not be trusting Democrats.
So what a lot of these groups are asking for is something that we've seen in other states that have similar constitutional deadlines, is to ask for relief from the courts. The COVID-19 pandemic offered extraneous circumstances that courts would take into consideration for not per se violating the Constitution, but for bending the rules a little bit and how these constitutional processes play themselves out. So you can presumably, because California's done it, Oregon's done it, Michigan's done it, states with similar deadlines to drawing maps that Illinois has, and the courts have granted some relief saying, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, you can't wait to draw maps for the census data to be released so that they're accurate and that they accurately portray vulnerable populations so they get the representation they need.
And that's an excellent point. Why didn't we ask for this relief 2 months ago, 3 months ago, a month ago? I mean, why are we here? Why didn't we ask for it?
It's a good question. I'm not sure anyone knows the answer.
Well, I'm not sure that I'm guessing, and this is just a guess on my part, that the folks that have the power kind of like it the way it is, and so that's why it's gone the way that it is. Let's talk about some of the specifics in the map here. One, the state Supreme Court maps that just came out. This hasn't been done in a long time.
And that one dropped just the other day.
Just the other day.
The legislative maps dropped on a Friday night,
right.
And it was Tuesday, not even 3 hours before the first of the last 4 hearings that they unleashed the Supreme Court map on us.
And arguably, the Supreme Court map is more important, really, than some of these legislative maps, because it is the Supreme Court. They get to make calls on stuff like the extending the deadline, which that didn't really happen, apparently. Or maybe a federal court could have done that, but the Supreme Court's important. I mean, of course, in any state. I mean, amongst other things here in Illinois, it's decided stuff like pension questions. Really big stuff, and they've redrawn it after Kilbride didn't get retained. So it appears to be, frankly, in some folks' view, a blatant attempt to keep the court democratic. Do you think so? Do we think so?
Leader Tim Butler certainly thinks so. Leading Republican at the MAPS hearing yesterday that they had, he brought this up. He said that Kilbride, who had in a previous decision kept map redistricting control in the hands of Democrats and in the hands of Madigan in 2016. He says this is more of the same. He says that since they lost Kilbride, now Democrats are going to be able to draw these new districts and maintain a majority that will make a favorable map decision to them. That's what Rutledge's claiming. That's what Republicans in general are claiming. Because if you look at these maps, in no way are they favorable to Republicans or bipartisan control in the judiciary or in the legislative sense.
Yeah, and the legislative part, let's talk about that for a second. I think what's gotten a lot of attention, partly because we're all here in Springfield, and so we pay perhaps more attention to central Illinois than other regions of the state, is the redistricting that has given, I think, Senator Doris Turner a much greater leg up than she might otherwise have had, would have enjoyed with the prior map. There had been a lot of speculation that she might not be able to. The Avery Bourne, the Republican who's currently in the House, was the heir apparent to the Senate seat, which had been held by Andy Menard before he stepped down and is now filled by Doris Turner. Also, we've got the map put Avery Bourne and I believe Mike Murphy into the same district. Fair or political or a mixture of both?
Well, whatever the reasoning behind it, the maps do seem to be more favorable to Democrats by placing a lot of incumbent Republicans into the same districts where they're now going to be having to compete with each other for space that previously they could share. And no matter how that ends up, it's going to be favorable to Democrats.
Strangely, there aren't that many Republicans to begin with, yet hardly any Democrats face the fate of being mapped in with a true competitor. There was at least one case where a Democrat was put into what would be called a Democrat district, along with an incumbent Republican. But I asked one of the members of the redistricting committee, how is this not a coincidence? How can you claim that it could be a coincidence? And he said, well, people who can just show up at our hearings.
And there were hearings and people showed up.
I think what it boils down to is they do it for the same reason that a dog is able to do, the same reason a dog does a certain thing, because he can. I'll tell you off air what that thing is.
Well, no, let's. That's fine. You can go on, Dave. Are we on a 30-second? No, we're
family show.
Don't go on. Stop.
Family show. Just say because he can.
Because you can. Other things that still need to be done before the end of the session. We've talked a bit about Exelon and their position trying to get some money for the nuclear plants. The other thing is cannabis, and this has been something that has not been working out as promised or planned since we legalized recreational marijuana starting January 1st of 2020, if I have my date right. Was it 2020 or 2019? 2020.
The bill was passed in 2019.
It's all a blur since then.
It is a blur. Since they opened those marijuana shops, I can't remember a darn thing. But they have legalized recreational marijuana with the promise that it would, the licensure mechanism would allow folks of color and folks who have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs to benefit from this by getting into the business, opening dispensaries and grow operations. But it's turned into a disaster. The first round of licensings under this bill resulted in insiders and folks who weren't of color on getting all the licenses or getting in the lottery to grant the licenses. Raymond, break it down for us. What's happened here and where do we go?
Well, first, there were 75 licenses that were supposed to be given out by May of 2020. Now we're over a year since that deadline has passed, and no new licenses have been given out. The only people who've been, by the way, making an absolute killing in the marijuana business have been big businesses that were already in the medical marijuana businesses who were able to parlay those licenses over to recreational dispensaries. Now, this new process that was supposed to, as you said, have a social equity lens in mind and give people in Black and brown communities, the power to get into this industry and make a lot of money for local communities, and that hasn't happened. Lawsuits have dragged on the process. The pandemic dragged on the process. And right now what we have is a trailer bill that has currently passed the House. It's waiting to be heard in the Senate. That's supposed to rectify the problems with the original 75 licenses that went to a lot of, as you said, people with some connections to the scoring firm behind how those licenses were measured for who is worthy of a license or not, and also offers an additional 110 licenses. We don't know, not everyone was happy with this. There was some bipartisan support, but also bipartisan opposition from some Democrats that felt like it wasn't in the social equity spirit the bill was intended. But really, it just seems like it hasn't gone the way it was supposed to.
It hasn't gone the way it's supposed to. So we're going to have now, if this passes, because it's passed out of the House now, and the Senate has largely dealt with this already. They've been, I think, probably further ahead on this than the House has. So presuming this passes, we will have a new lottery to grant licenses. What guarantees are there that Black and brown people will win this lottery? I mean, is there any guarantee? I mean, I look at this sometimes and I think there's some belief for one reason or another that if we have a second lottery, that the folks that are qualify for it will be, socially, the social equity applicants, the Black and brown people. Is there any guarantee of that?
No, and that was the nature of the dispute between Representative LaShawn Ford, the bill's sponsor of Chicago, and Representative Carol Ammons of Champaign-Urbana. She basically pointed that out. There is no guarantee in this bill that Black and brown communities are going to be able to get into the marijuana industry and bring in local money. And she said, what guarantee do I have for my constituents that money is going to be going to Urbana rather than going to an out-of-state owner who's partnered with someone in my industry? And on the floor, LaShawn Ford basically said there is no guarantee, and it's impossible to make a legislative guarantee that this goes to Black and brown communities. But what this legislation does that will now go forward with those 75 licenses and now an additional 110 licenses is that we've increased the possibility that now Black and brown communities, Black and brown business owners will get into the marijuana industry.
Right.
Specifically, there's 2 new lotteries on top of the first lottery for 75. These 2 new lotteries will give out 55 licenses each. And the second of those gives extra points if you were someone who was incarcerated for a marijuana charge that later was granted expungement under the 2019 law. That's to give people who have suffered from the war on drugs a leg up in the process. We don't have any data on how many people that actually is who've applied for these licenses that affects, but the spirit of this is it's supposed to try to increase the number of social equity applicants that will actually win. There was supposed to be a report a couple months ago from Toy Hutchinson, the cannabis czar, that hasn't been released. That's supposed to tell us, who's applying for these licenses, how the industry is impacting Black and brown communities. But it just seems to be a sort of fog of war right now where no one really knows if this is working as intended.
I'll be blunt. Why does Toy Hutchinson have a job? I mean, she is the de facto cannabis czar, and she was hired to do that at a salary in excess of $200,000 after being a state senator. She was the architect of this. That didn't work. And she hasn't come up with the report because really we pretty much all know what the report would say. It hasn't worked as you promised it would work when you wrote the bill. Why should somebody like that who has failed as a legislator to come up with a bill that worked? I guess the other question I have, not to be overly inarticulate, why do we need a cannabis czar at all? Why are we paying anybody $200,000 to oversee? a cannabis industry.
I mean, why not just fold it
Five
into
different regulatory.
ag or
Go ahead.
regulation or DNR or something?
I'm sorry, Dave?
Rather than have it run by some other department like ag or something?
Well, we have ag, we have Department of Financial and Professional Responsibility, we have Illinois State Police, we have, I think there's at least one other one, all of which are mentioned in terms of running a cannabis industry. And then apparently we have a cannabis czar that's supposed to be overseeing all of these folks. And I would love
Bruce, I would quote our mutual friend Mayor Langfelder and saying, that is a good question.
And speaking of good questions, the answer now is that we are out of time. And so thanks all for joining us on Capitol Week, Capitol View. I'm so sorry. And we'll see you next week. Thanks so much.